Oh, hey,
Okay,
hey,
we are live.
we are live. It happened.
Calling Chris Anderson there in the wherever you are. Where are you? It's
I'm at
exciting.
I'm at the Hotel Bristol in Warsaw, downtown Warsaw,
Wow.
and you are where?
I'm in my home studio here in Chicago. Does it look any different to you?
There's like yeah. So the right side of the screen there were fewer "I love me" plaques.
Yeah. I know. So I'll show you here. I'll take this off, and
Okay.
my
Oh,
bookshelves are gone because
and you're all
the
going digital.
the workmen are coming in tomorrow to put in the built-in
So you
bookshelves.
finally are going to get some.
Yes,
So you cheap
yes,
bastard, you're finally spending the money on bookshelves.
I am. And I got a set here and a set in the bedroom. Pretty
IKEA,
excited.
IKEA is never going to recover.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how these work out. Hey, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And Chris, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
Podcast.
podcast,
Ooh.
we're glad you're here. Today we'll be talking about the end of the war in the Pacific in 1945. And Chris, I should ask all our people who are watching to let us know what
Yes,
they're drinking, right?
absolutely.
And we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can support us on Patreon by clicking patreon.com/history happy hour. And Chris, I want to draw your attention to a
Okay.
new name on this list. It's in the second column, 4 names down. Can
Eric
you,
Flint.
Eric Flint? And now
He's back.
I want to say Eric Flint signed on as a top shelf patron 75 minutes ago.
Oh,
And
just
our
to be on here?
and our financial team and our graphics team were so efficient that they
Yeah.
managed to get him on here. And here's the thing, and I don't know, Eric, if you're watching, you can tell us where you are. But Eric's someplace in Europe also. He's leading a tour.
We're
He
all over the
flew
place.
over there 2 or 3 days ago. So I don't know if he's in London, Paris, Normandy, or what. But
Or what?
Eric, if you're there, let us know where you are. And thank you so much for your joining as a top shelf patron. We
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Well, welcome back, because I think he was one before.
And did you get a hat, Eric? Because if you don't have a hat, reach out to me. I'll get you a hat.
I guess he knows the guy. He knows the guy.
Yeah. So, all right, Chris, our guest is standing by patiently, wondering whether we're ever going to get to him. So,
Yes.
first of all, before we do, is there anybody out there
Well, there
in
are.
viewer land?
Yep, Xavier is joining us, so we're an
Oh,
international.
great to see
And
Xavier again.
Homer's back on us, with us from Fairfax.
Hey, Homer.
Yeah, and Lizzie Borden from London, and also closer to home. I want you to say History Happy Hour History. First time we have a live studio audience. Look at that.
Woo woo. Let's hear it from them.
Yeah, let's hear it from them.
All right.
Hey, oh, we have a sign that says, "Hey Rick, no ghosts here."
Oh, whoa,
There's-
whoa.
So you have to
whoa.
drink. You have to drink. Everybody has to drink. All right. There we go.
Crazy. Chris, give us a cue and let's get this ungainly ship onto the ocean.
Oh, all right. The bar is open.
The bar's open. What's on tap? What's
Yeah.
going on today?
Well, I'm thrilled and honored with our guest this week. We're being joined by Richard Overy, and Richard Overy, according to General Mark Miley, who some of you may have heard of before, is one of the world's finest military historians and probably the best historian of World War II writing in English today. And yeah, and then he has a long list of previous books, all of which have been very well received. We won't read all the titles because we'll be here for the whole show. But amongst his books are Why the Allies Won and the best-selling Blood and Ruins, which was the winner of the Society of Military History Distinguished Book Award, and his study of Hitler and Stalin, The Dictators, won the Wolfson History Prize. And he's currently residing in Italy, where it's a lot warmer than it is in England. And we are very, very happy to have him back to talk about his book, Reign of Ruin.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, there we
Yeah,
go.
there.
Oh, got the
Oh,
wrong book up there.
wrong.
Oh, next is okay. No, Reign of Ruin,
Yes.
and we'll say Richard Overy, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you.
Sorry, we showed the wrong book title there. I don't know.
We'll fix that.
I'm going to get on that department and
Yeah.
fire. Somebody's going to get fired.
So, Rich, at
Dip,
the
dip, dip, dip.
oh,
Did he bring a cocktail though?
he did. Oh yeah, good question.
Did you bring? Oh, okay, very good. And Chris, do you have a cocktail?
Well,
I asked the.
I do have a cocktail, and clearly you have one, and you've been drinking it because you put the wrong book up on this.
There you go. Okay.
All right. So anyway, about that history stuff. There we go.
There you go. All
That's
right.
the right book. So just at the start of this, as you begin the book, you say that the firebombing campaign and the nuclear attacks carried out by the Americans against Imperial Japan are treated as different subjects. Is that wrong? Are they not separate subjects, or why do you think there's that disconnect between the two?
Well, I mean, the disconnect is really that people focus a great deal on the two atomic attacks. It's seen as the opening of the nuclear age, and so it's seen to be, in some sense, qualitatively different. But my argument is that the heavy bombing of Japanese cities, which began with the bombing of Tokyo in March 1945, was a deadly campaign that went on the whole year until August, killing more than 250,000 Japanese civilians. And for the Air Force that dropped those incendiary bombs that burnt down Japanese cities, the two atomic attacks were really a continuation, in their view, of the assault on Japan's urban life. We've separated them out. But if you do that, I think what you miss is the impact that the conventional bombing had on the Japanese leadership. And my argument in the book is that actually it's, if anything, much more important than the impact of the two atomic attacks. So I see it as a continuum, finding ways to destroy Japan's capacity to make war until they surrendered. And LeMay, who led that campaign, the firebombing campaign, hoped that it would lead to Japan's surrender. You know, he had the same ambition that the people who dropped the two atomic bombs had.
So the United States launches that firebombing campaign in March of 1945. And one of the things I found fascinating in your book is that before that happened, we, the United States, carefully studied the effects of incendiary devices, even building literally mock-ups of Japanese buildings to see how quickly we could make them burn. And earlier in the war, Roosevelt, Churchill, and other leaders had gone on record declaring that intentional bombing of civilians was illegal, immoral, odious, shocking the conscience. Obviously, things changed, right? Points of view changed. So why did that happen? Why did we end up in this place where we were launching this essentially area bombing of Japan?
Well, I mean, in some ways, that's the most important question, I think. I mean, the Americans in Europe had focused a great deal on their idea of precision bombing, picking a particular strategic target and attacking it systematically. And they did that much more effectively than the British did in Europe. When it came to attacking the German Air Force, German chemical industry, German transport, and so on. But with Japan, they had already been thinking for some time about the possibility of using Japan's vulnerability, i.e., tightly packed wooden cities, using Japan's vulnerability to carry out a bombing campaign of a different kind. And throughout the war, as you say, I mean, the American Air Force was interested in incendiary bombing, had been studying it, developing the best incendiary bombs, practicing the destruction of German and Japanese houses from the air using fire. So that when LeMay finally decided in March 45 that he would change the way the Americans were attacking Japan's cities, there was already quite a lot of material behind that. It wasn't, in other words, taken simply blind. He knew that if you did what the British had done in Europe and you bombed the most heavily populated areas, the residential areas of Japanese cities, that might produce some kind of dividend. He wasn't quite sure what. He hoped it might lead to surrender. Um, but it was a shift in the way they thought about Europe, the way they thought about Japan.
And so also, Richard, you point out that strategic bombing is central. You say a central element in the Western strategic armory. And so why is that, and why is that not the case with, say, the Soviets? Because you mentioned that they don't have that sort of focus. Where is kind of what drives that emphasis?
Well, I think what drives it is that in both the British and the American case, they had thought about bombing at the end of the First World War. The British had begun a campaign, in fact, against German cities, and it was a form for them of economic warfare. If you wanted to degrade the war economy of your enemy, one of the ways of doing it effectively was from the air. And for the Americans and the British, that meant not having lots of bodies on, not lots of men on the ground, trench warfare, all the horrible things of the First World War. It was supposed to be a more efficient way of waging war. And I think for both the American forces and for the British armed forces, that was their priority. How can we get at the enemy, undermine the enemy, without having to create mass armies and recreate the First World War?
Richard, you touched on this a little bit, but the U.S. seems to treat Japan very differently than it does Germany and Italy in terms of how we attack them from the air. And I'm wondering, do you attribute this to, is it a racist or a cultural point of view, or is it simply the fact that now it's 1945, Germany is surrendering, we just really want to get this war over, and we don't care what we do to make it happen?
Well, it's all of those actually. I think I think racism is important. There's no doubt that the American leadership viewed the Japanese differently from the way they viewed the Germans, as did ordinary Americans and American soldiers. They viewed the Japanese differently. Uh, there was a general sense that the Japanese were in some sense primitive or even barbarous, and the behavior of Japanese soldiers in the field persuaded the American army that that it didn't matter what you did. You didn't have to worry about the morality of what you were doing. You were trying to defeat a ferocious enemy. But the other thing, of course, is that they wanted to get the war over as quickly as possible following the defeat of Germany. And that's what the bombing of Japan was supposed to contribute to, as indeed was the atomic bombing of Japan. But there's no doubt, I think, that in the American public, too, had a much more, not sympathetic isn't quite the right word, but they viewed Germans in a sense as equals, but they didn't view the Japanese like that. It worried the American public hardly at all. When the bombing of Dresden was reported in the United States, and there was a mistaken announcement from Eisenhower's headquarters that they were bombing refugees, there was something of an outcry in America. Americans were now bombing civilians deliberately. But when news of the bombing of Tokyo, the death of 83,000 people, arrived in the United States, there was almost no protest at all. In fact, the opposite. It was seen as a major victory, the start of a program that might deliver, surrender.
So another thing that I'd like to get your thoughts on is the plane that's at the center of all this. I think usually when you read about the war, obviously about B-29. You've heard about Boxcar and Enola Gay. They fly over Japan. They drop 2 atomic bombs, and that's sort of it. But the effort to develop and deploy the B-29 is a major accomplishment or a major effort in its own right. So, if you could talk a little bit about the aircraft that's used to carry out this campaign, and how its existence, does it drive strategic choices? Does it kind of force the Allies to make decisions because now that it's once it's been created?
Well, it absolutely drove strategic choices. I mean, Arnold had authorized the development of the bomber earlier in the war, actually before the war broke out, and he wanted to be able to produce an aircraft that really could reach Japan, because then the Air Force would be able to say, look, we're playing an important part in that campaign. It's not just the Army or the Marines or whatever. We are playing an important part in that campaign. And the B-29 was an extraordinarily novel aircraft, developed at some speed. In fact, there's so much speed that they had enormous range of technical problems all the way through, including when it was in service. So a lot of American airmen died because the plane was not yet fully operational. Um, but it did make a huge difference. Without the B-29, there's nothing they could do. They couldn't get near enough, and the B-17 would not have been an ideal aircraft to carry that out. So the B-29 did, in a sense, drive the strategy. And it's quite interesting that people focus a lot on the development of atomic bombs, the cost, the engineering difficulties, and so on. But the cost and engineering difficulties of getting the B-29 ready and operational were also enormous.
Yeah.
Didn't I read someplace that they were that the development of the B-29 was more expensive than the creation of the atomic bomb, or on the same scale?
No, it's 50% more expensive.
Yeah, I mean it's something that gets left out of a lot of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm wondering. We're talking about the U.S. Air Force uh, in terms of both the uh, area bombing campaign and the atomic bombs. What role does Air Corps politics play in the bombing of Japan? I mean, the U.S. Army Air Corps, which it is at that time, a part of the U.S. Army, wants to be a separate service. They want to make their own record. How does that play into the bombing campaign over Japan? And I guess I would say, I make it a two-part question. You can do that later, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
That it starts with like in middle of 1944, we start that we're bombing from China, but then it all changes. Take us through a little bit of what changes there, and how much of that is because of U.S. Army Air Corps politics.
Well, I mean, the shift from bombing from China to bombing from the Mariana Islands, which are much closer to the Japanese home islands, was simply a military decision. You couldn't achieve very much from China. As soon as those island bases became available, all the resources were shifted over, and it's quite understandable why that happened. Indeed, it had been planned in 1944 that once those bases were available. But the first part of your question really is very important, and I deal with it quite a lot in the book. Air Force politics was very important. The Air Force was anxious to be able to establish its independence of the Army. It had been anxious to try and do that in the 1930s and to develop a strategic profile which literally made it separate from the Army. And bombing was one way of doing that. But Arnold was not terribly happy with what happened in Europe because the Army took all the glory after D-Day, and the Air Force faded out, if you like, of public perception. So in the case of Japan, he was very, very keen, as were other Air Force leaders, very, very keen that the Air Force should be seen to be playing a major part in the final defeat of Japan, forcing them to surrender. And the Navy and the Army knew that that's what the Air Force wanted. They were not very happy about it. The Navy, particularly, after playing such a major role for 4 years in defeating Japan. But that's, it drove Arnold, it drove LeMay too, the thought that if they could just deliver on Japan, then Congress would deliver on an independent Air Force.
So, I want to turn to Operation Meeting House and the firebombing campaign soon, because that's obviously an important part of the book and an area that you feel is neglected. But at the very beginning of the book, you have General Marshall at a press conference saying, if war with the Japanese does come, we'll fight mercilessly. Flying fortresses will be dispatched immediately to set the paper cities of Japan on fire. There won't be any hesitation about bombing civilians. It will be all out. This is in November of 1941, so we're not even at war yet. Is he being prescient, or is he sort of just talking nonsense? Do you think there's a conception of where this is going to go, or is he just kind of being flipped?
Well, I don't think he would have understood very much about where it was going to go. And later on, he was actually rather critical of the bombing in 1945. I think that he was saying this in order to frighten the Japanese, in the hope that somebody was listening to him, and it was a press conference, somebody was listening to him might, slip it to the Japanese. This is the kind of threat they're facing. I think, in fact, that happened. But he's being bullish to get the Japanese worried. I mean, he knows perfectly well there's no way of bombing Japan in 1942.
Right.
Um, and when the bombing does begin in 1945, he's actually quite critical of it. When LeMay flew to Washington for a meeting, a very important meeting about where American strategy was going in June 45, Marshall was dismissive, really, of Air Force claims that they could end the war. He said, look what you've done to Tokyo, and it's made no difference. We're going to have to invade. In other words, it's going to have to be an army and marine operation, and not principally an air operation.
So, but now this is my second part. Yep, see, so given that answer, where kind of what is the genesis of Operation Meeting House and the firebombing campaign? Where does that come from? Because it seems to be something of a departure from what strategic bombing forces had done before that in American forces, I should say.
Yeah, no, it was. Yeah, no, I mean, it comes from. I've already, I think, said that there's a good deal of experiment and thinking about how to firebomb a city. Manuals on tactics and so on already been produced, etc., etc. And in Washington, the top command of the Air Force, uh, conscious that the Air Force has got to demonstrate something, uh, has begun to put pressure on LeMay's predecessor, Harry Hansel, and then on LeMay himself to think about bombing with incendiary attacks rather than high-level attacks which don't achieve much. And LeMay took that message. And he also knew about what had happened in Europe. I mean, he's not, in this sense, he's not a virgin commander. Um, and he realized that they wanted results. People in Washington wanted results, and so he thought, well, we're not getting very far that way. Let's do what the Brits did. We pack our planes with incendiaries. We send them in one at a time, dropping their load on an area that's already been marked by Pathfinder planes, and we concentrate that fire attack so that it produces a firestorm, as indeed it did. Um, so that's really where it comes from. And when LeMay reported 2 days later about what the results seemed to be in Tokyo, the Air Force High Command was delighted. Arnold sent congratulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said before, the curious thing is the American public didn't seem to mind the firebombing there, but they would certainly, I think, have minded if the American commanders had reported to the press that we have firebombed a German city.
So, talk about Curtis LeMay a little bit. He's a figure in both the bombing campaign and the atomic bomb. It all happens kind of under his command. What is he? Does he? If we're trying to assign credit or blame, depending on your point of view, for the results of the firebombing campaign, the results of bombing Japan. Does he, should he get a big share of that? And what did he say about what he did and what kind of, how he felt about it?
Well, he was very important. Yeah, I mean, he was a central figure all the way through. And indeed, as you make the point, it's worth remembering that the same Air Force that's been dropping the firebombs drops the atomic bombs too. It's not a different force. Um, LeMay actually didn't think the atomic bombs were really necessary because he thought the firebombing campaign would finish what he promised. Force Japanese surrender in September, perhaps October, at the very, very latest. And so he didn't think atomic bombs were that necessary. But later, he never had, in his memoirs, for example, he never had any regrets about what he did. There's a famous quote from his memoirs, think about the morality of what we did, nuts. I mean, he was a tough cookie, LeMay. And to him, the damage done to Japanese citizens, Japanese civilians, it didn't really matter. It mattered because he thought that would actually contribute more rapidly to Japan's defeat. And that was his priority.
So I think you had mentioned, and I think you're correct, that the dropping of the two bombs are the things that most people are aware of. I mean, they know that we firebombed Japan. but I don't think they understand the gravity of it, the size of it, the intensity of it. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about Operation Meeting House, the firebomb raids starting in March of '45. What was involved? What were the results? And what was the impact on the Japanese?
Well, the result was catastrophic, of course. They burnt down 16 square miles of the most densely populated urban area in the world. 83,000 people were burnt to death, or died in other ways, which is, if you think about it, a staggering statistic. Of people, killed in basically a few hours of bombing and a firestorm. Um, and LeMay wanted to repeat that, but very, very quickly, the Japanese urban population understood what happened in Tokyo and began to flee to the countryside. 10 million of them left and went to live in the small towns and villages. So that when the next wave of incendiary attacks occurred, the casualties were much, much lower. Cumulatively, of course, as you burnt down in the end 60% of Japan's urban area. Again, that's a staggering statistic. If you just think about a major state and just think that 60% of its urban area is gone, 10 million have gone to the countryside. Um, Now, this was a devastating campaign, and we know from eyewitness accounts and so on that this was one of the things that really worried Hirohito, Japanese emperor. And it worried him almost from the start. But by June, July, when LeMay began to bomb small cities and destroy them, sometimes 80, 90% of the area was destroyed, he became more and more anxious about the suffering of his people, more and more anxious that the war should be terminated. And I've argued in the book that if we look at the way over that period that Hirohito and his advisors, the peace faction, I've called them, reacted to the bombing, it's clear that the conventional bombing is every bit as important, if not more so, than the two atomic attacks. They wanted to find a way to terminate the war, to prevent the complete destruction of Japan from the air. And that was also the case even after Hiroshima, where the emperor is still referring to conventional bombing, firebombing, as a key factor in having to terminate the war.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting today with Richard Overy, who is the author of the book Reign of Ruin, among many other books that he has written about World War II history. And we're excited to have him here. I want to bring up a question that came from Wally Morrison, one of our viewers. And he says, rather than a racist indifference you imply about the fire bombings, could it not simply be that Americans simply wanted the war over, having been at it for a long time?
Well, American City did want to get the war over as soon as possible. And in summer 1945, the problem was that many of the intelligence predictions, which were fed through to Washington, to Marshall and so on, suggested that the war might actually go on until 1947. It was a tough nut to crack, it was assumed. And that would mean, a war that even, the American public might become very tired of continuing to support. But coming back to the first part of your question, there's plenty of evidence about the way in which American forces thought about the Japanese after they'd engaged them in conflict. And it's interesting, Arnold arrives in the Marianas to talk to LeMay in June, and he comes away from the Philippines having seen what the Japanese had done in Manila. And he says, we all think it, the Japanese deserve anything, kill them all, women, children, and so on. There's no basic empathy among American forces for the Japanese people. So, it's not written into the directives. It doesn't say we're bombing you because we don't like you racially. But it's part, I think, of the bombing culture in the Pacific War. The damage to the Japanese civilians was less worrying morally than damage, for example, to German civilians.
So we talk an awful lot about American strategic bombing and the development of the bombing, and that is something that appears in a lot of books. But you turn your attention to the Japanese in a way that I don't think most people do in their histories of the war. So let's talk about the other side, I guess, for a bit. What is the state of Japanese morale in 1945? Because, of course, the perception that I think most Americans have is that they're not going to surrender, they're going to fight to the death, so, all, the gloves are off. But you portray a somewhat more nuanced picture of Japan in 1945. So where are they at this point in the war?
Well, it is certainly true that the American military leadership did think that the Japanese were united, fanatical people, and that that's a factor you had to take into account if you were going to invade the home islands, how difficult it was going to be. But in fact, Japanese society was deeply demoralized by 1945. Most Japanese did not want to pick up a bamboo stave, and try and beat off Marines on the beach. They were hungry. They worked long hours. There was growing evidence of protests, things scribbled on walls and so on, even protests against the emperor, which was almost unprecedented. But I think that the important thing was really the effect on the elite, because there wasn't very much that the wider Japanese population could do. But the elite was very worried. They thought there was something they might do. They worried that they might, have a social revolution. They worried that Japan might collapse like Russia in 1917 or Germany in 1918. They had plenty of history to look back at. And they worried a lot about the prospect of communism in Japan working its way into the factories and so on. In fact, communism was almost entirely destroyed by the secret police in the 1930s, so there's little prospect of that. But I think the important thing is that for the Japanese leadership, once it became clear that Japan was A, not going to win the war, quite clearly not going to win the war, and B, that the Japanese people were not going to put up with this for very much longer, that's what turned their attention to thinking about terminating the war. I use that term because surrender could not be used. The word couldn't be used in front of the emperor. Terminating the war was what they wanted to do, and find a way of doing it which the Allies would accept. And that process goes really back to the spring of 1945. It's not prompted by the atomic bombs. But because Japanese politics is so divided, there are divisions within the military, divisions between the army and the navy, divisions within the civilian cabinet. They argue all the time about what's the best thing to do, how should our strategy develop. So rather than being a united, fanatical people, they're actually a rather confused and divided people. And the Americans, I think, never really realized that all the way through to the dropping of the bombs.
Well, you make the point that the Japanese never had to surrender in like the last 1,000 years. So this was an idea that was foreign to their culture. In 1945, they still hold masses of Chinese territory, other territory in South Asia. They still have millions of soldiers under arms. They can certainly continue to fight if they wish to. But what I found fascinating, and you did just touch on this, but maybe you can go into it a little bit more detail, is that they've been looking for a way to negotiate an end, a termination to this war for months. And I think at one point you suggested that maybe as much as a year before the dropping of the bombs that the Japanese were sort of looking for a way out. So what are they doing, right? So there's some people are thinking we should find a way. What are they doing to try to make that happen? And why does it go nowhere? Is it because of them? Is it because of us? Is it just the way it is? What's the story?
Well, one of the problems, of course, was unconditional surrender, because that was something the Japanese couldn't really accept, because they worried that that would mean the end of Japan, the destruction of the imperial system, the destruction of the nation. It didn't. For them, they were uncertain really what the Americans meant when they talked about unconditional surrender. But the real problem was that the Japanese politics moved very slowly. The emperor couldn't take a real decision. He had to listen to the cabinet. He could talk to them, ask them to do something, but he couldn't take a decision. And the cabinet was stalemated because some of the military wanted to fight that final battle, the apocalyptic battle, go down in national suicide, which was really nonsense. While the peace faction, some military, but otherwise civilians, they wanted to find a way to terminate the war. There was at first a sense that if they could just win one victory, they could then talk to the Americans rather than abjectly surrender, they could say, well, we won that, but let's see what ground we have for an agreement. But Hirohito gave that up by the time of the fall of Okinawa in June. And he said to the army, to me about this, but the real problem is, you can't win anything. And you're not going to win the battle for Japan. When the Americans invade, they'll invade. And so they tried to find another way out, a complicated way out. Let's try the Soviet Union. Let's ask the Soviet Union and see whether they will intercede on our behalf to, broker some sort of agreement with the Allies. But by that stage, agreement for Hirohito really was accepting the Allied ultimatum published in the Potsdam Declaration in late July, which really was unconditional surrender, but they wanted to call it something different. So it's a slow process, and they're thinking all the time, how can we do it? How can we approach it? What the Americans thinking? And you have to remember, of course, the Japanese had no intelligence at all on what was going on in Washington. Just as Washington had very little intelligence about what was happening at the center of politics in Tokyo. And so the Japanese just felt incoherently for 2 or 3 months before the atomic bombing, were trying to find a way in which they could terminate the war in ways in which they could guarantee the survival of the imperial system, but at the same time have to accept in the end much of what the Allies are demanding.
So, you've talked about this peace faction in Japan and Japan's war weariness. But one of the things that strikes me, and I'm wondering if you found any evidence of this, there has to be people in the Japanese high command, Japanese leadership that are somewhat aware of how they've behaved earlier in the war. Against the Chinese, against American forces in the Philippines, against Filipinos. The list goes on and on. As they're trying to say, well, we have to come up with a way of ending this, do they acknowledge any guilt in this? Do they see that this behavior might make negotiation difficult? Because I don't see any sense that they're aware, that anybody in Japan is aware that, kind of what's happened.
Well, I mean, the media are completely controlled. And in fact, there is an extraordinary disconnect between how the Japanese are behaving in Burma, in Southeast Asia, and so on, in China, and the way in which the Japanese population and the politicians at the center in Tokyo are thinking about the war. I think that, for many of them, there really was no understanding about what was going on because it wasn't reported back. We've done such and such an atrocity, obviously. And there was even a belief, in fact, that it was the Americans who were, being barbarous. All that stuff about the Americans cutting off Japanese heads and sending the skull back to their girlfriends and so on, which was widely publicized in Japan. So for many Japanese, the opposite. They thought the Americans were the atrocious ones rather than, Japan's own soldiers. So there was a disconnect between the way in which the Japanese military and officials had behaved in the empire and the way in which the Japanese home population and home civilian politicians understood it.
But I'm curious about the Japanese leadership. Is anybody in the Japanese leadership saying it's going to be difficult to convince the Americans that we want peace, or,
Is there anybody who's taking what we would now say was a realistic view of the situation?
Well, I think most of them had a realistic view. Even the army hardliners actually knew they were losing the war and would lose the war, and that he would lose an invasion of the home islands. For them, it's difficult to say so because they worried about the demoralizing effect it would have on Japanese forces. And also, it was alien really in the sense of their culture. The idea of giving up or surrendering or not being adequate. But I think it's almost certain that they did war minister, particularly in the army, did understand that that they were on hiding into nothing. And so when the discussions about termination of the war came, they would make all these loud rhetorical noises. No, we must have the final battle, etc., etc. But I think that they understood the limits of what what was possible. So that when finally Hirohito says, I'm going to make a decision, and he makes it on August the 10th, there's almost no opposition from the Navy and Army leadership. There's some opposition, but the War Minister and the Navy Minister are united, and we have to accept what the Emperor says. And I think that partly they understood that there was no way in which Japan could win this war.
Well, it's right. This is the age-old story. Leonard Cohen wrote about it in his song "Everybody Knows." Everybody knows what's going on, but in this case, everybody wants somebody else to do something, right? So
Yes,
they don't want to be the one to say we should surrender. I'll
yeah,
take it over to you. I'll take it over to you.
yes,
Um, um, it goes on today. A lot has been made in the telling of this story about the Japanese response to the Potsdam Declaration, which comes in late July. What is it, July 30th, July 31st? Reaffirming that the Allies were calling for an unconditional surrender. And this is a week or so before the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. And the Japanese response to this uses the word mokusatsu, to kill with silence, which can be translated in different ways, some harsher, some more mild. And there are some commentators after the war who suggested that the U.S. missed the correct meaning. And if we hadn't, maybe there could have been a road to peace that didn't involve the atomic bombs. And I myself have written about this, so I'm very curious about your point of view. Is there anything to this, or is this basically just making a lot of hooey out of nothing after the war is over?
yeah. I mean, I think the Japanese government and Prime Minister didn't really think it was worth replying because they'd already got all these details before, so they knew what the Allied position was. I mean, the thing the Allies, I think, didn't understand was that they didn't make this as a formal requirement sent to the Foreign Ministry of Japan in Tokyo, so that the Japanese Foreign Ministry could, react to it. It was simply broadcast to them, and I think that the Americans misunderstood the extent to which the Japanese, if they were going to be presented with the ultimatum, needed to be presented with it in a more formal way rather than just hearing it on the radio. And so yes, they knew this story and they knew what the Allies wanted, and so they couldn't see any need for them to say, "Oh yes, thank you, we knew that, but we haven't made up our mind yet." So yes, I mean, an understandable silence, I think, but I think the American reaction is bizarre because I don't quite see how Truman and his advisors expected, once they'd heard this broadcast ultimatum, expected the Japanese to put their hands up and say, "Oh yes, okay, we agree." No, it's bound to be a much more complicated process than that, as it turned out to be. But what it did do, of course, as you suggested, is apparently trigger the decision to drop the bombs. But in fact, the decision to drop the bombs, the order to Karl Spaatz, head of strategic air forces in the Pacific, had already been issued 3 days before.
So, obviously the focus is on the bombing campaign of Japan, but another key element of this story that you bring in, that again most Americans I don't think are completely aware of, is the threat of the Russian invasion and Russian participation in the war. So perhaps you could touch a little bit on that. What was coming down the pike on that part of the front, and Japan's reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps the central debate or argument, I think, about the Japanese surrender. Was it the Russian invasion or was it the atomic bombs? I mean, that presents, I think, too stark a contrast. In my book, I make the point that really, the Hirohito's final decision is to do with, the fact he doesn't think that they have any chance of defeating an invasion. That the civilian bombing has gone on too long and the suffering is too great. There's a fear of social unrest. There are a lot of things that Hirohito is juggling with in arriving at the view that he has to accept the ultimatum. And then on the morning of the 9th of August, 3 days after Hiroshima, arrives the news that the Russians are at war with them. Not only at war with them, but I mean, they're carving a front out in Manchuria like a knife through butter. And this really does focus the mind of the Japanese leadership. They, of course, are terrified of communism, and they're terrified of the idea that somehow or other the Russians will get there before the Americans, which suddenly begins to look feasible. And they're very worried that the Russians will have communist agents and so on inside Japan, and they'll link up. And I think that this debate has gone on for a long time, but I think the evidence makes it clear that the attitude to atomic bombing was ambiguous. They weren't quite sure what it meant. They weren't quite sure what it was an atomic bomb. They weren't sure what the Americans had anymore. But the Russian invasion of Manchuria was very real. And within days, of course, Manchuria was overrun. And I think that, it's that which pushes the cabinet and the peace faction to persuade Hirohito on the evening of the 9th of August to call an imperial conference at which he says, you have got to accept the ultimatum and I want you all to agree with me. And that was a critical factor. It's the same day that Nagasaki was bombed. But again, Nagasaki, according to testimony from the time, Nagasaki really made little impact on the Japanese leadership. What really worried them was that that the war might end up, as I've said before, like the crisis in Russia in 1917 or Germany in 1918.
Well, one of the things, though, that you brought out in the book that I really hadn't thought about much is that there were other bombs in the pipeline, other atomic bombs in the pipeline, and supposedly, I don't remember the exact numbers, but that Hap Arnold was telling the president, "Well, we won't have another one till October, but we can have 5 in November and 5 in December, or something like 10 other bombs." So if Japan had not surrendered, this could have turned into a thermonuclear nightmare.
That was the idea, yes. I mean, to wage nuclear war, and I think that most of the histories actually of the atomic bombs make a great deal about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only two in the inventory. But in fact, now once they got those, they knew how to produce them. They were going to produce them quite rapidly through September, October, November, December, and they had already drawn up a plan of the cities they were going to bomb. And so, yes, if Japan had not surrendered, the United States Air Force would now be waging the first nuclear war. Thank God they didn't. But yes, that was certainly in the pipeline.
So I think, when you read a book like this, one of the things that people are going to be curious about is, the big questions are, was it necessary? Were there alternatives? Was it sort of the wrong course to take given Western impressions of their enemy at that time? What kind of conclusions do you come down to? Were there alternatives for Truman? Was this perhaps the wrong policy? Is it understandable that they did what they did?
Well, I mean, I think alternative history is very difficult, and I've tried in my book to explain why they took the decisions they did take. Not what might have happened if something different had taken place. I mean, obviously, the conclusion you would draw from reading my book is that the atomic bombs probably were not necessary. That Hirohito was coming to the point where he had to terminate the war. That the conventional bombing was not going to stop, and it didn't stop. It went on all the way through August the 6th to 9th and beyond. That the Japanese population would not put up with this very much longer, and all the evidence suggested that Japan could not really resist an American invasion. So better just to terminate the war before that happened, and the cost of Japanese people of having to fight that kind of war. All those things I think are important. I mean, I think people reading my book might expect me to say, in the final chapter, these bombs are not necessary. I'm leaving people to draw their own conclusion.
Sure. But, one of the things that I find interesting, again, in the conclusion of the book, you talk about, or you give the example of the Osaka International Peace Center. And it's a museum that tries to get built. They want to bring in certain I guess, threads to the interpretation, and it doesn't go so well. So, what happens with the Peace Center and other peace museums that try to get started, and what is the challenge of interpreting this event now? I mean, because
Yeah.
obviously that's also kind of the legacy of this. How do we all of us, we the Japanese, we the American, why is this so hard to get our hands around?
Well, I think for the American side, it's not been so difficult. Of course, there's been a fraction of American opinion all the way through who was hostile to the use of the bomb, and felt not it wasn't necessary, but felt that it was immoral and a war crime. Um, but the bulk of American public, I think, even today, would basically take the view that the bombs ended the war, forced Japanese surrender, and therefore for all the horrors it caused, it was worth doing it. But the curious thing, I think, is the Japanese reaction, because although you would expect the Japanese to be pretty hostile to the idea of having two atomic bombs dropped on them, but after 1945, they were not allowed to research it, they were not allowed to talk about it or publish about it. And by the time they were able to, when Japan regained its sovereignty in 1952, they had a defense pact, security pact with the United States, which has been the central feature of Japan's security ever since. They had a formal peace treaty, and they didn't want to rock the boat by telling the Americans, you shouldn't have done this. And so the Japanese peace initiatives from the 1950s onwards were always carried out by ordinary people, by civilian officials, by city mayors, and so on. But the government view always was that you can't rock the boat. And even as late as the 1990s, when the United Nations was debating whether it was consistent with international law to be able to drop an atomic bomb, and this was debated in the United Nations, and the Japanese abstained. And you would think that, of any country that would say, it was illegitimate to drop an atomic bomb, it would be Japan. So their reaction, I think, has always been very ambiguous. The other problem the peace museums have faced, I think, is that nationalists in Japan are very anxious not to make too much of what the Japanese did in their empire. So that they can then blame the Americans for firebombing, blame the Americans for the atomic bomb, but not blame themselves for what it was they did in the empire. And peace museums that tried to put both sides often found it very difficult to do so.
So we have a question from one of our viewers, Katiki Miller, who says, are there lessons learned from this war for us and the Japanese military that we can use now with respect to the Chinese military saber rattling of late? So you said that there was no question we couldn't ask you, so we're putting this one on to you to see what you have to say.
Yeah. The first point I want to make is that actually, I'm often asked, can we compare today with the 1930s and 40s? And I always say that, each age is different. We moved on a lot from then. And the circumstances, whether they're geopolitical or military or whatever, are very different now from what they were then. I mean, the lesson I hope we would learn from, this war and the book I've written, of course, the lesson I hope people would learn is that nuclear war must be avoided at all costs. And that it's very easy to slip into the idea that nuclear war will solve your problems. And so we need to keep reminding ourselves all the time that nuclear war is not a solution. It's a problem. And we hear all the rhetoric at the moment. Well, you talk about China, but one talks about Putin's Russia, where he and his government constantly referring to the nuclear threat, and they don't push us too far, and so on and so on. I mean, I don't think they would launch nuclear war because everybody knows that mutual destruction is still the reality. But one of the things that I wish people would learn from this war is that don't run that risk.
Chris, we do have time for one more if you have one more.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would just
Put
kind
you
of
in the spot this time.
no, I mean, we've it's such a big topic, and of course, there's so much more in the book that we didn't get to.
Yes.
And surely is kind of a talk shop question to Richard is you've written so much about the war, you've delved into this in so many different ways. As General Miley said, you're one of the greatest historians writing about the war. When you were researching this book, was there anything that you were struck by, or anything that seemed new to you, or caused you to pause and say, I hadn't looked, something that caused you to stop?
Well, two things, I think. I mean, the first thing I make this point in the press thing is that I looked at the English documents as well, British documents as well, which are almost always left out of the discussion of the American Air War in the Pacific. But actually, the British had really quite a lot to contribute, not least to helping the Americans to understand the nature of incendiary firebombing. And they also wanted to contribute to the development of the atomic weapon, and they did so. That's again often airbrushed out of discussions about how the atomic bomb was developed, the Manhattan Project was developed. The British wanted to take part in the final bombing of Japan, made great efforts to try and get Lancaster bombers there, or the Lancaster successor, a Lincoln bomber there, so they could help to firebomb Japanese cities as well. And I think that it's not that I want to blame Britain, but I mean I think Britain needs to be put back into the picture, because Britain was keen on bombing and firebombing in Europe, and they wanted to take part in what was going on in Japan. But the second thing I think that really surprised me, I think, and which perhaps I haven't emphasized enough in the book, is the responsibility scientists have in developing the worst weapons. And what's clear from the Oppenheimer story and the story of Los Alamos, the area where the bomb was developed and engineered, is that the scientists played a major part in pushing that through, working as hard as they could, desperately get a bomb that could be used while the war was on. And then in the end, Oppenheimer's science committee desperate to drop a bomb on the center of a Japanese city. And I think that did surprise me more. I've seen it much more in the past as a military decision, but in fact, the scientists played a very important part, and they continue to play an important part. They're developing thermonuclear bombs of extraordinary capacity, and you do wonder, how is it that scientists can work on that kind of project and then go home at night and sleep with a clear conscience?
Ooh, I haven't done that in a long time. Richard Overy, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your terrific new book, Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan. It covers the bombing campaign. It covers the atomic bombs. It covers in detail the response of the Japanese government, the aftermath. It's a short book, but it's an excellent book, and we appreciate your joining us to talk about it.
It's really
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. Chris, yes, I know it's late, and I want to know, is your audience still there? And can we get a visual and tilt down a little bit, because mostly we saw the ceiling before.
There we go, live action cam. We can fly. That's part of it. It's a sold out house here. Look at this over here.
Okay. Woo! All right, wow.
First ever live audience.
And yeah, your sound is going. Is your sound still there?
Okay. Is it better?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So you'll have to let me know afterwards what their reaction was. And I mean, it's positive so far, but I want to get
one and done. But
I want to get the inside story.
Okay.
Yeah. So next week we have on the person whose book I showed before, Timothy Ryback, another very distinguished historian who's written a book called Takeover: Hitler's Final Rise to Power, focusing on the 6 months before Hitler takes power in Nazi Germany. And I will be reading that as I fly to Paris to start a campaign on the last 6 months of World War II, Operation Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, etc.
Well, I'll be in Berlin where the handover happened and that picture was taken.
Okay, so we have we'll be close to the topic, and we'll be talking about it, and we'll be having Wi-Fi problems, and it's going to be awesome. Want to say, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast. Please back us on Patreon like Eric Flint, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.